Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining our e-seminar today, Applying the Constraints-Led Approach to the Evaluation and Treatment of Balance and Mobility Disorders. My name is Teresa Boone, and I'm the Director of Global Education at Natus Medical, and I'm delighted to host today's presentation. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker. Deborah Rose is a professor in the Kinesiology Department and Director of the Institute of Gerontology, an award-winning Center for Successful Aging at California State University in Fullerton. She also serves as co-director of the Fall Prevention Center of Excellence, established in 2005 with funding from the Archstone Foundation. Dr. Rose received her Master's of Science from the University of Oregon in 1982 and her PhD from Penn State University in 1985. Her primary research focus is in the area of postural control, mobility enhancement, and the prevention of falls in later years. Frequently recognized for her contributions to scientific literature and profession overall, Dr. Rose also is the developer of the innovative fall risk reduction program called Fall Proof, which was recognized by the Health Promotion Institute of the National Council on Aging in 2006 as a best practices program in health promotion. This program is currently being replicated in numerous community-based settings and retirement communities throughout the United States. Without further delay, I'd like to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Dr. Rose. Dr. Rose, the presentation is yours.
Thank you so much, Teresa. I'd also like to thank Natus Medical for the invitation to present this morning, and I look forward to sharing with you the knowledge that I have relative to applying the constraints-led approach to the evaluation and treatment of balance and mobility disorders. I have three major goals in the e-seminar today. The first is to help you understand the benefits of adopting a multi-system approach to the evaluation of balance and mobility disorders. I'd also like to assist you learn how to construct an effective balance and mobility training program using the constraints-led approach to motor coordination. And finally, I'd like to share the core components of fall risk reduction programs that are aimed at reducing falls among older adults in particular at different levels of fall risk. I would say, however, that any of the principles that I talk about today can certainly be applied to a number of different clinical populations, including children. So why adopt a multi-system approach to evaluation? Well, we know knowing who is at risk for falls is really only the first step. We have a plethora of assessment tools out there that are very good at identifying the risk for falls, and we often choose them because they're quick and efficient to administer. The problem is that at the end of that particular one-legged stance or perhaps a forward functional reach, we may have a lot of information about the level of risk that the individual is at, but we know very little about what is contributing to that risk. We also need to understand that balance is complex. It has many, many systems that are contributing to whether or not an individual is able to maintain and or move through space with great efficiency. So in adopting a multi-system approach, we can now better identify the underlying postural control systems that may be contributing to the balance disorder. In knowing that, we can now use those results to better tailor the rehabilitation to the identified impairments and functional limitations. So I'd like to share with you a model that I've been impressed with for many years and has really shaped my own theoretical framework for designing effective fall risk reduction programs. And I take this from Faye Horrocks' work, which began in 1997, and in 2010 she produced a somewhat more simplified version of her multi-systems approach. There on the screen, what you can see is there are at least 6 important postural control systems that are contributing to good balance. There may indeed be more than the first 6 that I'm going to share with you today, but these will really form the basis of an effective program. So we see here biomechanical constraints. Clearly, the structural anatomy of an individual and how they've been physically active during their life is going to very much determine the level of range of motion that they have, the level of strength they have, and will also determine the verticality of their posture. We then also look at stability limits and verticality. Here we're interested in determining how far can an individual lean through their limits of stability and how well can they maintain verticality. Here we're looking at both an interaction between the sensory and the motor systems, the sensory system giving us the perception of verticality, and the motor system determining whether we can actually achieve that verticality and how far we can lean through those limits of stability. Anticipatory postural adjustments are also critical to us being able to work proactively in our daily lives as opposed to reactively. When we're stepping off those curbs or we're preparing to turn, shifting our weight onto one limb to initiate gait, lifting our arms up, or pushing a door open, we're relying heavily on anticipatory postural adjustments to stabilize the trunk and legs as we move any smaller part of the body. Postural responses are, of course, a very important system as well. What we have here is we have a reaction to a loss of balance, and that may be either internally or externally precipitated. We come around to sensory orientation, and obviously knowing where we are in space is going to be critical about making good decisions to move through space in an efficient manner. Here we really rely on our visual, somatosensory, and vestibular systems to provide us with the input that we need across a variety of different environmental contexts. And lastly, as we begin to move, we're seeking stability in gait. And for that, we need to be able to adjust accordingly to changes in task demands. That may be running for a bus. It may be adjusting to somebody stepping out in front or a car coming quickly around the curb. So while we're seeking stability in gait, we're not seeking a stereotypical gait. In fact, we're really looking to have a gait pattern that is flexible and adaptable to changing task demands and changing environments. So with that framework in mind, what I'd like to do is share with you some both computerized postural dynamography assessments and functional assessments that you can break down and really see which subsystems are actually being addressed by that particular assessment. For me, in designing effective balance and mobility programs, it's critical for me to try to ascertain as much information about the patient or client as I can, and that begins with a thorough assessment of balance and mobility. So if we look at computerized postural dynamography, which I have been a user of since the late 80s, we can look at how the various force platform and related software can be utilized to really evaluate the different subsystems. So with biomechanical constraints, we can use functional testing on the force platforms. We can look to see range of motion. We can ascertain strength simply by asking them to perform different activities that require strength and range of motion. A test that I use frequently is the limits of stability test, which enables me to really understand how efficiently and how far an individual is able to move through space in 8 different directions. While the functional reach is helpful in terms of telling us how far a person is able to reach in a forward direction, a test such as the limits of stability test is going to give us information both about forward reach but also about lateral and backward ability to lean as well, which we know is going to be highly related to an ability to be able to react to a loss of balance. Anticipatory postural adjustments, again, can be done via a number of different functional activities on the force platform, whether that be doing a one-legged stance on the platform, whether it be using a long force plate to do step up and over, walking and turning, tandem walk. All of these are going to give us wonderful information about the individual's anticipatory postural adjustments. And in terms of postural responses, on the unit that we use, we have the option of doing the adaptation test, which is a perturbation test that administers a forward or a backward change in the force platform, which really triggers reactive postural control. And then, of course, the motor control test is going to give us information about an individual's ability to be able to adjust to a loss of balance that happens in a low, moderate, or high intensity. Sensory orientation can be very nicely passed by using the sensory organization test, which allows us to look at both the combined contributions of the visual, somatosensory, and vestibular system, and each of the contributions of the visual, somatosensory, and vestibular conditions. And finally, for stability and gait, if I'm using computerized postural dynamography, I will always add a 10-meter walk test performed at both a preferred and a maximum speed to determine the individual's ability to walk with stability, but also to change speed based on changing task demands. Now, if I weren't using computer or postural dynamography, I could use a number of different multi-item functional tests to look at those same system subscales. So I've chosen just 4 today. 2 of them extremely well known. They've been in the field for a very long time, commonly used by clinicians. And this is just an opportunity for us to look at the number of tasks on each of these scales that may be addressing these different subsystem components. We have a tendency to look at that final score, and that gives us very good information about their overall balance and, in most cases, their level of full risk. But it really tells us very little about what are the underlying impairments and functional limitations that are contributing to this full risk. So if we look at the performance-oriented mobility assessment developed by Tinetti, and excuse me, it's not Berg, it's Tinetti on this slide, you'll see that there are a number of tasks that are addressing biomechanical constraints. There's at least 1 activity that is looking at stability limits, verticality, 3 that are looking at anticipatory postural adjustments, and as you can see at the very bottom, a high number looking at stability and gait, because the performance-oriented mobility assessment has both a balance component and a gait component. So if I were to use both of those components, I would know quite a lot about the individual that I'm working with as it relates to underlying contributions to the balance impairments that I'm observing. If we look at the Berg Balance Scale, again, a very well-used functional assessment tool that's comprised of 14 test items, we see here that it doesn't do quite as good a job at looking at each of the subsystems. Obviously, there is no reactive postural response that's required on the Berg Balance Scale, so we know little about postural responses unless the individual loses balance during the performance of another task. In terms of sensory orientation, we know a little bit about the contributions of the somatosensory system as a function of the individual performing the stand with eyes closed for 10 seconds task, but we know very little else about the contribution of vision in the vestibular system. And stability and gait is minimally evaluated really when we're starting to look at turning in a full circle would be the only activity that really looks at that particular subsystem. Of course, both the Tinetti Performance-Oriented Mobility Assessment and the Berg Balance Scale were not designed with the systems approach framework in mind. But it's interesting to go back and to look at these particular functional scales and determine how well they actually do in evaluating different subsystems. And then more recently, Hotari and colleagues developed the short form version of the Berg Balance Scale, which only contains 9 items. And here again now you see fewer of the subsystems that are now being evaluated by that scale. Of course, a shorter scale is going to be performed in a more efficient period of time, but it's not going to provide as much information as the longer Berg Balance Scale. The Balance Evaluation System test, which was developed by Horrocks and colleagues, was very much systematically designed based on her previously developed multi-systems approach. So you can see that there is particular care to organize tasks such that they are really evaluating each of the systems that we're most interested in looking at as contributions to balance and mobility. Of course, her original BEST test, comprised of 36 test items, becomes a difficult one to perform in the clinic. It takes quite a bit more time, but I'm often of the mindset that taking additional time to get more information about the patient or client actually shortcuts the actual clinical time that one spends with a patient or client, because you know so much more about that individual. So you can begin tailoring the program much, much more quickly. Of course, the BEST test has now been modified by two different groups. Franciagnoni et al. In Italy, in collaboration with Horrocks, developed what is called the mini BEST test. Immediately you can see that fewer systems are being developed here, and in fact Franciagnoni really biased the choice of tasks based on a dynamic balance construct. So using their rationalysis, they determined that a set number of activities on the mini BEST test were really speaking to dynamic balance impairments. This is only a 15-item test and is done in a much faster time period than the original BEST test. And of course, finally, the brief BEST test was also developed by Paget and colleagues, and their goal was rather to maintain the systems framework that Horrocks had originally developed. So you see here, even though there are only 8 tasks on the brief BEST test, each one of the subsystems is being nicely evaluated with one or more tasks on the test. So as you make decisions about which tool to use, whether it be a functional test, and my bias is always to use multi-item functional tests, or if you have the good fortune to have computerized postural dynamography, you can get a very good understanding of the multiple systems that are contributing to the balance impairments. And finally, the Fullerton Advanced Balance Scale, which was developed here at Fullerton, was also systematically developed based on the systems approach to motor control. So here again, on the 10-item Fullerton Advanced Balance Scale, what you can see is that each of the 6 systems are being targeted by one or more activities that are being administered on that scale. Unlike the previous scales, the Fullerton Advanced Balance Scale has been targeting older adults who are at an earlier stage of developing balance impairments, and it was really designed to offset some of the ceiling and floor effects that were produced by the Berg Balance Scale, so that we can begin to identify early impairments in balance and gait. And that test is one that we use almost exclusively in our community-based programs. So that's giving you a very brief overview of some of the more common tests, and perhaps a couple of new tests that some of you may be very familiar with, but others still becoming aware of, which leads us into now taking that systems approach and combining it with a constraint-led approach to movement coordination. And this was a beautiful framework that was developed in 1986 by Carl Newell to really address the interaction that occurs between an individual's capabilities, the demands of a task, and the environmental constraints that are imposed upon that person. And this is a framework that has guided my work over the last 20 years, so that it is easier and more effective to develop a multi-system balance and mobility training program that also looks at what is the contribution of the task demands and what is the contribution of the environment. We see that any of our subsystems, whether it be related to biomechanical constraints, sensory orientation, or anticipatory postural adjustments, are clearly going to be influenced by the nature of the task demands and also by the environmental constraints. In terms of core assumptions related to that test, there are 3 important categories of constraints that Newell argues shapes the emerging control and coordination of movements. So as we look at our older adult here on the right-hand side of the screen, we can immediately begin to identify individual or organismic constraints that are contributing to her current postural control. We see that she's using an assistive device, so it's fairly clear that there are individual or organismic constraints that are contributing to her inability to walk independently. We also see that her sense of verticality has become impaired, and more than likely, if we were to see her moving with this assistive device, we see that stability and gait is rather poor unless she was working with her assisted device. We would also imagine that if we were to change the task demands for this individual while walking on a stable, firm surface would not be difficult for her. If we were to change the task demands, perhaps ask her to walk more quickly or to walk while talking to somebody else, we would see some changes in her balance and mobility. And finally, the environment will play a very large role for this older adult because of her need to use an assistive device. Inclines, declines, negotiating curbs, walking on compliance surfaces will be very difficult for her to achieve in the situation that she currently finds herself in. So when I'm thinking about designing balance and mobility programs, I go back to the multi-system approach and I consider what are the core program components that are going to address each of these subsystems contributing to our postural control. If one thinks about biomechanical constraints, then clearly core program components of strength and flexibility must not be ignored. And we know that balance combined with strength are at least the two minimal components that constitute an effective balance and mobility training program. When I think about stability limits and verticality, I immediately think of creating center of gravity control training, wherein the goal here is to assist the patient or client be able to maintain standing balance across a variety of different task demands and environments, but also be able to shift weight, transfer weight, and ambulate efficiently and smoothly through space. The sensory orientation really including a core component that addresses systematically the contribution of each of the three systems that contribute to balance, being vision, somatosensory, and the vestibular system. Anticipatory postural adjustments, again, can be folded into the center of gravity control training component of the program. Postural responses require postural strategy training. We know that 3 postural strategies have been identified in the literature: the ankle, the hip, and the step strategy, where perhaps we're most concerned is helping the client or patient utilize the appropriate postural response for the task and or environment in which they find themselves, and scaling that postural response to be able to make an efficient response to a change in environmental or task demands. And finally, stability and gait leads me to develop a core component that is really aimed at both enhancing and varying the gait pattern so that it remains as flexible and as adaptable as it can be as we change the task demands and or the environment changes. So let's look at some of the examples that we could use to really evaluate how effective the program is going to be. So when I immediately think of manipulating the environment, the first principle that I think about are the sensory systems. And what we know is the sensory systems are responsive to the manipulation of environmental constraints. So when I'm constructing this component of the program, I'm thinking about what are the environmental situations in which vision is going to be dominant, which are those situations in which I'm going to be forcing more of the use of the somatosensory system, and which are the environments that I can construct that are going to require a more dominant use of the vestibular system. So if we look down here at the very first example, we have an individual who's standing on a compliant surface and the eyes are open. In this situation, what we're expecting is that vision is going to be the primary sensory system that's contributing to upright control. And of course, coupling that with teaching good gaze stabilization techniques should ensure that over time the individual will learn better to use vision depending on how impaired vision is. If we come across to this next example, we have an older adult where we've increased the challenge in terms of task demands by reducing the base of support. But out of a compliant surface underneath that is now distorting somatosensory inputs, leading the individual to use vision as the primary source of information for maintaining upright postural control during gait. If we move to our third example, we have our juggling queen here, who's standing on a compliant surface and is tossing an object from hand to hand. In this situation, again, we're distorting the somatosensory system, but now we're engaging vision in the performance of a secondary task. So from many different perspectives, this becomes a much more challenging task because not only is the individual standing on a compliant surface with vision engaged, therefore forcing more of the use of the vestibular system, but we've now added a secondary manual task, which is also going to elevate the attentional demands of the particular task at hand. And here, if we work in a group situation, we have individuals who are standing on a compliant surface and playing an activity called balloon volleyball. Here again, we're engaging vision, we're adding a secondary task, and we're also adding a compliant surface, which is going to put more of a contribution from the vestibular system in hand. So there are many different ways that we can manipulate the environmental constraints to really force the use of the sensory systems. Here are some other examples. We can use compliant moving or inclined surfaces. Vision can be engaged, reduced, distracted, or absent. We can also create busy visual environments by changing the visual flow. Adding individuals or more visual flow is going to make a much more challenging environment for the individual. So our goal in this sensory orientation phase of the program is to optimize the functioning of each of the three sensory systems that contribute to balance. We're interested in teaching gaze stabilization in static and dynamic environments. So finding that vertical target which is going to help with verticality, and always remembering to find that vertical target with every change in head movement. As we know, for those of us that work with older adults with balance and mobility disorders, it is very difficult for them to focus on a vertical target. They're much more interested in whether the feet are moving forward in front of them or whether there's an obstacle in their way. So perhaps gaze stabilization techniques are one of the most important things to teach an older adult or any individual who does not use vision well to better improve their postural control. If we want to force the use of the somatosensory system, then we want to disadvantage vision now so that it forces the individual to work on identifying what they're receiving from both the cutaneous and the proprioceptive receptors in the body. And of course, to promote the use of the vestibular system, we now need to disadvantage both the somatosensory and the visual systems. Here now we need to understand, however, whether or not our goal is going to be to optimize function or whether our goal is going to be to compensate for sensory impairments that are permanent or progressive. So in the case of knowing that sensory systems are intact or an impairment is temporary, we want to optimize the function of that particular system. And even in the case of impairments beginning in that system, we still want to assist the client or patient use that system as best they can. In the case of sensory impairments that are permanent or progressive, whether that be macular degeneration as a visual disorder, whether it be sensory neuropathy that's going to affect an individual's ability to detect ground cues under the soles of the feet, or it's a vestibular deficit that is permanent or progressive. Now our goal is to offset that permanent or progressive impairment by really tuning up the other systems that remain intact. Of course, we know the challenge becomes ever more difficult as the client or patient develops impairments in 1, 2, or even 3 of the sensory systems. So if I'm thinking about stimulating the use of the somatosensory system, my goal is going to be to disadvantage vision, but to perform all activities on a firm, broad, stable surface, so we optimize the individual's opportunity to use ground cues to provide them with information about where they are in space. We want to engage vision, particularly in the early stages of a program where the patient or client may be extremely anxious if we ask them to close their eyes, or we even reduce vision by asking them to wear glasses. So engaging vision can oftentimes be the lowest order progression that we use. And over here on the right-hand side, you see that this individual is seated on a compliant surface, but their feet are in contact with a firm, broad surface, and they're reaching for objects. So now vision has been engaged, forcing the use of the somatosensory system to contribute more to postural control. We can also reduce or remove vision, as I indicated earlier, by asking an individual to wear dark glasses, and we can go to the full progression of asking the individual to close their eyes. We can also distract vision by adding a busy background, and here you see that a checkerboard pattern is being moved through the visual field of the older adult client, so that vision is now distracted, again forcing the use of the somatosensory system. If we want to stimulate the use of vision, we do completely the opposite. We disadvantage the somatosensory system by manipulating the surface. All of these activities can be progressed very naturally from a seated to a standing to moving activities, and those can be done on compliant surfaces of different densities and on moving surfaces of different intensities. So over here you see a client that is in a high level of progression working on a uniplanar rocker board. Arms are folded across the chest, which now really forces the use of vision to maintain postural control. And down here again you see an individual who is in a reduced base of support walking across a compliant surface using gaze stabilization techniques. So here again, as we come back to the constraints-led approach, we see this interaction between the individual, the task, and the environment. So we've talked a little bit about sensory orientation, and if we come over to our first box, our individual box, we see that the capabilities of the individual in terms of their flexibility, their strength, their medical conditions that may be contributing to some of their postural control issues, their level of cognition, and whether or not they have profound sensory loss is going to influence how they respond in a variety of different tasks in task environments. So the more individual constraints that we see emerging, the more we need to focus on lower order activities, beginning in seated positions, doing single tasks, and then ultimately moving to standing tasks, moving tasks, and as a higher order progression, moving to multiple tasks, wherein the individual is now having to control their posture more from a subconscious perspective as they direct more of their attention to performing a secondary task. And then, of course, you saw with the sensory orientation component of the program that the environment was very important in terms of manipulating each of the three different sensory systems that contribute to balance. A word on practice environments. All of these principles apply whether we're actually designing the program on computerized postural dynamography units, whether we're working in groups in the community, or whether we're working in a home environment. I actually began implementing the constraints-led approach using computerized postural dynamography exclusively and found that it was very effective in allowing me to train individuals at higher risk for falls in an extremely safe environment, but be able to vary both the surround and the surface so that I could create a level of systematic challenge for clients. So irrespective of the practice environment that you find yourself in, whether you, again, have the use of computerized postural dynamography, which has the added advantage of visual biofeedback that is extremely powerful in assisting the older adult achieve a better postural control, you can still use any of these principles, whether it be in a clinical setting without posturography, whether it be in a community-based setting, in a group environment, or whether it be in a home environment working one-to-one with a particular client. Let's talk a little bit about manipulating the task demands now as we move to that task demands box in the constraints-led approach. A principle that I use to guide me in the development of this component of the program is the principle that the motor system is particularly responsive to the manipulation of task demands. So changing task demands is really going to involve the motor system in a very important way during the program. So as you look across the bottom of the slide here, you see that we can begin in a seated position, asking the individual to lean in different directions with the eyes open. We can actually ask individuals to be manipulating an object using their foot, so that now they're using the lower body system to control balance. We can work on weight shifting and weight transfer activities through space. We can also work on reaching activities, and here you see a combination of both changing the environmental constraints and the task demands. So clearly a higher level of progression for the client who's standing on a reduced surface that is compliant while reaching for an object in front. And again, as we work on that center of gravity control training, we see here that the client is moving through space and bending down to pick up objects as they manipulate, as they move through an area of objects. So stability limits and verticality can be enhanced through the COG training component of the program. A sample progression might look like starting in a seated position where the goal is to maintain balance with and without the use of arm or leg movements. For very low-level clients, maintaining balance in and of itself is going to be a major challenge for them. And for individuals who are higher functioning, integrating arms and legs into the movement is going to force greater control of the center of mass. We can then move to leaning the trunk in multiple directions, so now the center of mass is moving further through space and thereby increasing the level of challenge, all the way to moving to weight shifts in multiple directions. So as you look here on the right-hand side of the slide, you see one of the lower level progressions where an individual is seated on a stool with a compliant surface underneath them. That could be lowered still further to having an individual sit on a straight-backed chair with arms and no compliant surface underneath them. We then move to a higher level progression where the individual is seated on a balance ball and performing trunk leans in a backward direction. And finally, we can look at an individual who is moving through space, doing weight shifts in multiple directions, again on a balance ball. Note the different positions of the arms, starting with the arms on the chair. So we have the highest level of stability with the arms being in contact with the chair, moving to the arms being on the thigh to increase the level of challenge, and then further up to the hips, and then potentially across the chest. So hand position can be changed, level of surface compliance underneath the buttocks. We can add a cognitive or manual task. We can alter the base of support, or we can vary the pacing of the activity. All these will change the task demands and really elevate the level of progression. In standing positions, some sample progressions would be maintaining balance, again with altered basis of support, leaning the trunk in multiple directions, engaging in weight shift activities in multiple directions, weight transfers in multiple directions, and then we can then overlay task demands where the individual is using hand support or no hand support, varied pacing again, the base of support is changing, or we can add a manual or cognitive task. So there are a plethora of ways in which we can perform different activities, the same standing position, but vary the task demands so we elevate the level of challenge associated with the activity. And of course, if we're working in group environments, which is largely what I do on a daily basis, we can then integrate a lot of the activities we've been doing into culminating activities that really elevate the enjoyment of a class. And examples you see here are things like hot potato, which will reinforce trunk leans, trunk rotations with or without arm movements. We've got line passing, which will really reinforce leaning, rotating, and weight shifting. And something that a lot of my clients enjoy to do is standing soccer, where we can reinforce weight shifts and transfers while they're in a reduced base of support. And then moving on to anticipatory postural adjustments, here we're reaching for objects in space, whether it be in a seated, standing, or moving environment, is going to systematically progress the activities. Here's where we introduce turning activities, negotiating obstacles, pushing and pulling objects of different weights, all requiring anticipatory postural adjustments. And then finally adopting different body positions, whether it be one-legged stance or tandem walk, that's going to require that anticipatory shift of the posture to move into the new position. Postural responses are perhaps the most challenging thing to integrate into a balance and mobility program. They can be internally or externally applied. In many cases, many of the activities you're going to introduce in the center of gravity control training are indeed going to really work on internal perturbations, and they may be very small perturbations to begin with, coming up to larger perturbations as they have to initiate a step to regain their balance. So an unexpected loss of balance during performance of an activity can occur. Obviously, we want to make sure that the environment is extremely safe as that occurs. There can be an external application of force that's intended to displace the body position. That may be small pulls and pushes as the individual is in a seated or a standing position. And then increasing the attentional load by introducing a second task can oftentimes lead to an internal perturbation that's created by dividing attention. I don't know how we jump to stimulating the use of the vestibular system, but in the sensory orientation section of the component, engaging, distracting, or removing vision on a compliant or moving surface is going to be the third thing that we do to really improve the contribution of the vestibular system. We know that these are going to be the most challenging situations for any patient or client that we're working with because we're disadvantaging two systems. So it's very important that the progression be gradual and well developed for this particular environment. And finally, when we look at stability and gait, here again we can manipulate the task demands, we can change the base of support, we can walk on toes, walk on heels, we can vary the pacing. I like to do a lot of activities where I'm asking the client to move more quickly, slow down, stop, turn, all really working to improve the flexibility and adaptability of the gait pattern. Obstacle negotiation becomes an important component of the program here. And then finally, at the highest level of progression, adding a cognitive or manual task to divide attention and thereby force the stability of gait to be more subconsciously controlled. And then finally, manipulating the environmental demands. Again, the surface type, the amount of vision, and or the visual flow. Having people move backwards and forwards as an individual is moving through the environment. So the final piece that I want to leave you with are some of the best practice recommendations that have really emerged from the research literature over the past 15 to 20 years. And to that end, Kathy Sherrington and her colleagues in Sydney, Australia, have done some beautiful work analyzing all of the exercise-based interventions that have been used to reduce fall risk among older adults in particular. We see here that the key practice recommendations are a moderate to high challenge. If we're not systematically increasing the challenge associated with the activities that we're doing, then we really can't expect that there's going to be a significant amount of improvement from the client. We also know that it must be of a sufficient dose. So we know that in clinical settings it's often very difficult to achieve the dose that we believe to be important for really making significant and long-term changes in postural control. And that's where the community becomes a very important source for finding programs post-discharge from a clinical setting. Ongoing exercise is necessary, so not only getting the patient and client on board with the program, but getting them so involved in the program that they want to continue to be physically active or engage in exercise in an ongoing way. Targeting the delivery strategy to the risk level. We know that many of the activities that I've presented to you on these slides will be suitable for some individuals, but they will be unsuitable for other individuals. We also know that we can be equally effective in group or one-to-one settings, so allowing the client to have choice in the setting in which they engage in exercise becomes an important consideration. Including a walking program can be helpful, but not at the expense of balance training. There's a lot of indication in the literature that walking programs may not be suitable for individuals at higher risk for falls who really need to be working in more supervised balance training environments. And obviously including a strength training component is extremely important to any effective balance and mobility component. And we also know that as the level of risk increases, exercise alone may not be sufficient, that indeed the patient or client may need other interventions by other medical personnel to offset some of the constraints that they're experiencing as an individual, whether that be related to the medical conditions that they're experiencing, the type of medications that they're on, or other issues that need to be addressed beyond exercise. So I very much thank you for your attention this morning, and as Teresa indicated at the beginning of the presentation, a PDF version of these slides will be available to you on the Center for Successful Aging website, and you can see the link here on the last slide. If you're not quick enough to take down the link, if you simply Google Center for Successful Aging, you'll more than likely see that our center will appear in the first or second offering on the website. So thank you again for your attention this morning, and I hope that you've been able to derive some good information that you can take back to the setting in which you're working with your clients or patients.
Dr. Rose, thank you so much for that very thorough and informative presentation. This will conclude the recording of today's presentation.